Hello, Mr. Montalvo here, U.S. History, and today our topic is debates over slavery during the Constitutional Convention. Now, our objectives for today are to examine the counting of enslaved African Americans for the purpose of congressional representation and taxation, ultimately known as the Three-Fifths Compromise. In addition to that, we're going to try to identify how people in power have acted to extend the concept of freedom, the practice of social justice, and the protection of human rights in United States history. And then, unfortunately, how some of them have not acted to support the same. Now, before moving forward, it's important to understand the other compromises during the Constitutional Convention, because the Constitutional Convention was full of them. Now, most recently, we discussed the Connecticut Compromise, or the Great Compromise, which was a mix between the Virginia Plan that favored or benefited larger states and the New Jersey Plan that benefited smaller states. And so in order to move forward, try to understand or refresh yourself on the Great Compromise or Connecticut Compromise, because it will have implications in this concept as well. So of the 55 delegates, about 25 owned slaves. The delegates from the southern states wanted to count slaves as part of their population. Why? This would give the southern states additional representatives in the House of Representatives. And if we remember, according to the Great Compromise, the House of Representatives was based on proportional representation, which means based on the population. Larger the population, larger the amount of seats in the House of Representatives, and as a result, more of a say when it comes to legislation. Delegates from the northern states opposed this, arguing that if slaves had no rights to vote, then the South should not be given additional representatives. Now, how did the tenets or the ideas of the Great Compromise, that compromise between the smaller and larger states, affect the debate over slavery during the Constitution? Try to think about that. They agreed that 3/5 of slaves would be counted as part of the population. In other words, if a state had 5,000 slaves, 3,000 of them would be counted as part of the state's population. The agreement about the issue of slavery made by the delegates would become known as the 3/5 Compromise. And we have to understand the hypocrisy of this entire situation. African Americans in this new United States of America, a country whose Declaration of Independence and eventual Constitution describe that all men are created equal, does not afford that same advantage to people of color, to African Americans, to slaves. Now, the 3/5 Compromise established a system, formal, of counting slaves for not only population, but taxation. The 3/5 Compromise reduced the fear of the loss of representation by the southern states with larger populations. Northern delegates wanted Congress to ban the slave trade in the entire nation. Now, the Southerners warned that if the slave trade was banned, it would ruin the Southern economy. Southern states would not agree to a constitution that banned slavery. And in that idea or way of thinking or ideology, they were standing strong, standing firm. Congress compromised. Now, often when we think of a compromise, we think of both sides walking away with something beneficial or positive, and both sides winning. However, in this case, there is one definite loser. The population of African Americans who, as we said, are not only enslaved, but then in the terms of the government that they live under, are counted as less than a whole person. So Congress agreed that they would not outlaw slavery, at least for 20 years, put a pause on the topic in hopes that this would encourage the southern states to agree to the Constitution. Now, think about our conversations when we discuss colonization and the development of the southern colonies. How would the abolishing of slavery negatively affect the Southern economy? Southern states insisted that escaped slaves be returned to them. Otherwise, slaves would have a strong incentive to escape to a northern state where they could be free. Northern delegates agreed to what would become known as the Fugitive Slave Clause, which required runaway slaves to be returned to their owners upon the demand of such owner. Now, these warrants, these descriptions of individuals who supposedly escaped were extremely vague, and headhunting, or the idea of capturing enslaved African Americans, or slave catchers as they would become known, or slave hunters, would become a very lucrative business. And in many cases, there are many documented cases of individuals who were multi-generational, free for generations. Their great-grandparents were freed African Americans who are caught up in this situation and then sold into slavery. This is captured in a novel and also a movie entitled 12 Years a Slave, in a pretty accurate depiction. So, not wanting to use the word slave, the Fugitive Slave Clause replaced or substituted it with person held in the service of labor in place of the word slave. Now, you may have heard this before, but words matter. They matter a lot. The architects of this Constitution, the writers, knew that this Constitution would last. They wanted it to last. The Articles of Confederation didn't. And so they omit, they leave out the word slave for that reason, for optics, because of how bad it looked on this document encapsulating all these ideas of freedom and equality. Now, some delegates did speak out. One such delegate was a man by the name of Governor Morris. No, not a governor himself. That's just his first name. He's a senator from New York. He was outraged that any compromise would be reached at all, the idea that this was even a topic of conversation. During the convention on August 8th, he gave what would become known as his famous Curse of Heaven speech, describing the fact that how could these states be asking for their slave population to be represented when they themselves are not receiving any other benefits of citizenry, of citizenship. Now, attached to this lesson is an analysis of these two excerpts from the Constitution describing the Fugitive Slave Clause, and this excerpt from Governor Morris's Curse of Heaven speech that I highly suggest you check out. So in addition to that document analysis as I just discussed, there's a guided reading attached to this lesson as well, taking a look at the Constitution and slavery. Now, wrapping up, try to describe the purpose of the Fugitive Slave Clause, and then explain the compromises. The Fugitive Slave Clause is not just one. We have the Fugitive Slave Clause, we have the compromise to hold the discussion of the debate over slavery for 20 years, and we have the ThreeFifths Compromise. So these compromises explain how they were made surrounding slavery and the Constitution. And that's all for today. Thank you.